All right, well, we are now talking to Sensei Lawrence Boydston, 8th Dan in Denzin Ryu, based in Santa Monica, California, whom we've had the honor of presenting today at the Western Regional Seminar here in Las Vegas, and terrific presentation. I caught most of it as I was doing some of these. Tell me a bit about your martial arts background, what you grew up doing, and how that evolved into jiu-jitsu.
Okay. I started Danzanryu Jiu-Jitsu when I was a senior in high school, and continued doing it during my college days. Dabbled a little bit in judo, but it wasn't until I graduated college that I started judo formally, 1972. And I did Kodokan Judo, played it, and got hurt a while, but I made Shodan, got points for a Nidan and stuff. During that time, I got to about Sandan in Danzanryu Jiu-Jitsu. I started to school teach in LA, and a year or two into the school teaching, I started at the Dan Inosanto Academy in Marina del Rey. Actually, at the time, it was in Culver City, but and that was sort of like grad school. Most of the people that were studying there were black belts in different martial arts, and they'd heard about Bruce Lee's martial art, which is what we studied, which was called Jun Fong Gung Fu. Bruce Lee's real name is Jun Fong. Okay, it's not Bruce, that's his Americanized name.
And the name of
his style, though, was called JKD. But JKD is actually Bruce Lee's own personal pathway to learning. Jun Fong was the school that he taught the basics and stuff. And the guy who was his head instructor was Dan Inosanto, who he'd met at the 1964 Long Beach Invitational. He was one of Ed Parker's organizers for the event. And he was taking care of Bruce, who was one of the demonstrators there. And they got together and became friends and student-teacher together. And they're sort of the opposite. Dan was a little older than Bruce, but he did. Now, Dan is Filipino-American, and when he'd been studied in the service and got out, he studied Ed Parker's Kimpo. And Ed Parker said, "You're Filipino, why don't you study Filipino martial arts?" He didn't know much about it, so he went and talked to his father, who happened to be a pretty famous guy in the labor market in Sacramento. No, excuse me, Stockton. And so he was able to introduce him to Filipino martial arts. At that time, they were not teaching publicly Filipino martial arts.
And why was that?
Well, they hid it since the World War II, really. They did it during the war. If they immigrated to America, they didn't talk about fighting or anything like that. And there was an incident in the 60s where I think some Filipino nurses were killed in Chicago or something like that. And the Filipino community goes, "Well, we have arts, why weren't they able to defend themselves?" Something like 7 or 8 nurses. And that's when they finally brought Filipino martial arts to the public. Very much in the 60s, but not in the 50s.
So it took that triggering tragedy to get
yes,
going.
And it's what made it American in my American public. It still was very low key in places like Stockton. But Dan was a black belt under Ed Parker. He was studying Bruce Lee's Jun Fong Gung Fu, and Gung Fu being the northern style, Hong Kong, well, southern style, excuse me, Hong Kong. And so I studied at the academy, and we basically had courses mixing those two together. And then we had visiting instructors come by. We had a Muay Thai teacher who came in once a month and taught the seniors. We had guys that went over and became black belts in Savate. So some of us took up box fronts as Savate. Dan was getting into Salat. So we learned the basics of Salat. We'd have guys come in from Hong Kong that did Wing Chun. They go do Black Belt Magazine, come see Dan and do a demo or work out at our class. So we got introduced to a lot of guys just before they broke the cover to Black Belt magazine.
It's amazing.
Penjat Salat, before coming from Indonesia, one of the first instructor, Eddie Joffrey was there. Different Filipino martial arts, Chinese from Wing Chun.
It sounds like you lived, or you're in a place where there's an influx of so many different arts.
Yeah.
And this is a different story from what I'm hearing from other instructors who are about your age, where it was a little more narrow, where it was you do one thing for decades.
Dan had mentioned that was the way when he grew up. He said, I had a Chinese instructor, I had an Okinawan instructor. I never told them about either one. I went to study each one, but they didn't know I studied the other things. In those days, you couldn't do that.
Because they would be offended by that?
Yeah, it was very exclusive. You were a high student, you study only what I teach you. Dan was, by training and by his mother, was an American school teacher. That's what his mom was, one of the first Filipino-American school teachers in Stockton in the United States. She worked for 40 years in the Stockton school district, and he did 18 years as a school teacher. So he's got very much, he's not Oriental in his accent. He was an American athlete, American school teacher.
Right.
He teaches it as an American approach to things.
So he was
and
more
taking the culture from other places, but with a very much, he has a master's in education. And so he looked at it and taught it as a physical education thing, an athletic approach. And he loved to look at the commonality between different martial arts.
Very interesting. How did you end up focusing on Denzin Ryu?
Well, I never gave up Denzin. I mean, I was a Sandan when I started it. I was a Sandan for about 10 or 12 years, the same rank, but I was doing 10 years of Inosanto thing. And some of my friends were also black belts in Dan's Ryu. We were doing Inosanto thing. And we met a person who got reintroduced to us, Professor Wally J., who's famous in Dan's Ryu. And
small circle.
He didn't know us, but I'd met him when I was 19 or something. And Professor Wally J. had a great memory for people. If he met you, 30 years later, he could met you and tell you where he met you and what your family background if you talked about it.
Amazing. Wow.
That was how he networked with people. He could always remember who you are and never forget you. Wow. And people, he drew a lot of people into him like that. Now, Wally J. had actually taught Bruce Lee. When Bruce Lee came to this country, he's a very young Chinese martial artist. Well, at the time, Wally J. was a Chinese-American martial artist in his 40s or 50s, and he toured about thing. And when he met Bruce Lee, he treated him as he invited him to parties, and so just as an older martial artist, appreciating a younger man. Sure. And Bruce Lee remembered that because there weren't a lot of people that sort of welcomed him to the United States.
There was
to do
resistance,
And he was also an older Chinese American, and acceptance from an older person in the Chinese culture very important.
Yeah.
And very few did he get that thing when he moved to Seattle originally, and then down into Oakland, and then down later on to LA. And so the connection to Dan and his son, oh, you were Bruce Lee's friend. He talked about you. Oh, let me study for. And Dan is one of those guys that never puts a martial artist down, makes him feel comfortable, will study for him. He isn't just loud in his school. He'll get out there on the mat and take your class. That's what he does. It's just his approach to
beginner's mind.
Oh, very much so. And the school teacher. Oh, let's see what you have in commonality with this. He liked to talk about the commonality of martial arts. Okay, I got hurt early. Both knees got hurt early 90s. Took one of my friends that I'd started in Santo with, I mentioned Cliff Stewart.
Yes.
And he'd been doing being a bodyguard for about 25 years. Had his son get born, and he sort of, I got to get away from the bodyguarding. So he got into pre and post production TV and films, Wesley Snipes was one of the films he used
Oh.
to work on, The Blade and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Some of
martial
the
arts,
fight
right.
scenes he helped choreograph.
Oh.
He was also the security on those movies in Europe. So he'd been involved with Intersanto like I was. So he started teaching his own. He had like a bodyguards he would train, but he also developed it for individuals. Some were martial arts, some were not. They teach them basically personal protection.
So he was able to adapt to the needs of
Yeah,
security
and
guards and common people. Yeah.
He has something, or had something, that I really don't do. He had personal experience. He was
As a bodyguard.
as a bodyguard, as a very intelligent, highly paid, and at the higher levels of movie stars and personalities and stuff like that, that he ran securities, not that he was just a bodyguard.
Yeah.
He ran the whole
He had
organization.
organizational abilities.
And he actually, for a time, had a bodyguard school that he was training wannabe bodyguards how to do it well.
Yeah.
They had shooting practice, they had driving practices, they had how to handle your client, how to shield your client, things like that.
Right.
But what I basically loved about Cliff is he'd been in some situations which violence was required. He met it and handled it, but he didn't lose control. And enough so he kept getting hired by top people.
So this is real hardcore need to defend someone from deadly attacks.
And I've always been a person that, a science background, I look to reality as your proof of where it works or not.
Right.
Well, if I'm not going out being a bodyguard or breaking up and getting in fights, I don't really know what works or not. I need to go to the person that's done the walk, okay?
Yeah.
Cliff was one of those guys. Taught me a lot about what you can do and can't. And
How did you integrate that into your own teaching?
well, I had a lot of different martial arts. I was looking at it as understanding. Okay, Dan Inosanto talked about this. You don't study a martial art to become that martial art. You integrate it into what you are. So you take the parts that you can use and do and produce and express. And so I don't do Jun Fan. I learned from Jun Fan. I learned from Filipino martial arts. I learned from Jiu-Jitsu and Judo.
And that becomes part of
Yeah,
you, your
right.
given experience.
But when I teach, okay, later on, in my 50s, I took some Kempo because, well, I didn't trust my shoulders and arms holding up, and I wanted to see if it would work. Luckily, that reinforced it. Yeah, you can still do things, but, even with getting older and injuries and stuff.
Yeah.
And what I developed over time from the 90s on was what I call my own experience for learning martial arts. I call it Quest Martial Science.
How does
I
that work?
teach that to my friends, and it used to be my friends from Danzuru Jiu-Jitsu, and I cross-train them in other things. We basically do 3 parts, what I call weapons and movement, atemi, and then grappling or Jiu-Jitsu. Those are all because if you're doing self-defense, you probably have to have a response in all those areas.
Well, and you bring up weapons, and they're a reality to, depending on what state you're in, concealed carry of guns or
Right.
knives or pepper gel or whatever. Is that part of your normal training for everyone, or how does that work?
Stick and knife, yes. I have some gum disarms, and I use them from what Cliff taught and what he did with the FBI and stuff like that. But I personally don't know if well, he described it. It's within arm's reach. What do you think a gun disarm kit? Can it work at all? Can you disarm someone? Only under certain conditions. If you're close enough within arm's reach is when you might have a chance for doing a gun disarm. But you could talk about tactics of guns and his bodyguard things when they learn to shoot. You need to understand the time and the place where it could be used and can't be, or what we talked about way later, 20, 30 years later, an active gun I was a school teacher. I just retired, but
Active
we
shooter
actually talked
situations.
about guns on campus.
Yeah, somebody comes in with
Yeah,
an
and we
assault
had one
rifle.
of his friends who'd been an CIA operative and worked for police and FBI, I think, for a while, talk about active gun things, what you can and can't do. But from a realistic, people have either seen it happen,
Right.
had to deal with it, or did the write-ups when they had an incident happen.
Right.
And I think that's the science part of martial arts to me.
Yeah.
I don't practice what they did in the 16th century or 15th,
Right. Because it's not relevant to today.
It's not relevant to us teachers
Yeah.
or a self-defense jujitsu.
Right.
I would like my friends to be able to protect themselves and their family and go home at night.
Right. Realistic application.
Now, it was mentioned in this seminar, the idea of getting into a personal fight is almost immature ego getting in the way.
Right. It should be able to be dealt with in some verbal fashion or avoidance or situational awareness.
And to me, morally, it makes a lot of sense in that I will hurt someone to protect my loved ones and myself included.
Right.
But I don't feel I need to morally hurt someone or beat them to the ground just because my ego gets involved.
Right, to prove a point.
Right.
Yeah.
But the idea of escaping, avoiding it ahead of time, seems to me a lot better mental jiu-jitsu approach to the tactics. Okay.
And that goes back thousands of years to,
Yeah,
or hundreds of
and
years.
we're a different civilization.
Right.
Yeah, so samurai got to carry, well, even they can't carry a sword anymore.
Right.
And
The greatest battle, the greatest way to win a battle is by avoiding
Right.
the battle you're doomed to lose or
and
lose.
even then, let's talk about what we all might see. People that are on drugs, drunk, or delusional. Some of the techniques that we use for intimidation or control might
Don't
not
work.
work on those
Sure.
situations.
Yeah.
So you got to have a realistic feedback here. People that are crazy, you can't
reason with them.
You
You're not
can't
gonna
reason
scare
with them. You can't
Right, so
talk
there
them
has to
down. You
be
can't
some-
diffuse it
Right.
sometimes. You can't control them. They have adrenaline surges are all the way up there.
Sure.
But maybe just avoiding them is the smartest move you did.
And if it comes-
especially take your loved one and get them away from
Right.
the crazies, or put yourself as a barrier between them and your loved ones.
Exactly. And if it comes to the point of having to confront them physically, maybe reducing their mobility or thinking in terms of,
Yeah.
well, this person's on drugs, but they would not be able to attack me if I broke their leg or broke their arm or something, where there's that real mechanical limitation. I don't know how possible that is, but it's people on drugs have capabilities that you have to take into account that are beyond what a person.
I
not
worked
on-
in emergency room out of college, and there were stories by the cops that would come in and talk, and they talked about angel dust in those days, where someone had loaded a gun in the person, and they ran off. After they loaded, shot off the fire.
Yeah.
And it was scaring the living daylights out of them, because
Yeah.
they had to use deadly force, and it still didn't
I know.
intimidate them.
Still able
and
to do
the
harm.
cops I'm hearing the story afterwards, and they're still nervous because they go, "What can we do next? What if you attacked us after we did this?"
Exactly.
Because the guy was not in the right mind.
Yeah.
And I remember those stories, and it was like, oh, okay, I don't want to face that either.
Yeah.
And what would I do?
Absolutely. Fascinating. An exciting note to draw this to a close.
Right.
Thank you so much, Lawrence,
Sure.
for this. This could be the basis of a lot of further discussions. I have some great footage. But thank you again for coming
Okay.
to this, and we'll see you at the next Western Regional Seminar, maybe before then out in Santa Monica.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.